Hi guys, so today I wanted to get started with Unit 1 Diversity of Living Organisms and Chapter 1 The Living World. So before we dive into this chapter, I'd like us to do an exercise together. Now, this is something that I do whenever I'm trying to absorb new information from a textbook especially. I try to read all the headings, the subheadings and all the things that are highlighted, kind of skimming through the chapter and getting a sense of what it's going to be about. This always helps me kind of wake up when I'm studying and also just retain the information better and understand it more deeply. So why don't we try doing that right now? I have the electronic version of our textbook open here, and we're just going to skim through this and see what things are standing out. So what is living? Taxonomical categories, taxonomical aids. Okay, maybe it's talking about classification, something. They sound like heavy words. All living organisms grow. Okay, it's pretty general stuff now. Reproduction. Okay, maybe they're talking about unicellular organisms and how they reproduce. Okay, maybe they're going into sexual and asexual reproduction. Metabolism, that reminds me of catabolism and anabolism that I studied in my previous classes. Cellular organization, okay, maybe that has something to do with cells, tissues and organs. Okay, maybe. Consciousness, this is getting a little philosophical. Maybe they're talking about sleep and wakefulness and how aware we are of our surroundings. Maybe. So we'll find out and learn more about these things in detail soon, but as of now we have a vague sense of what it is like. And some questions I have are, what are these growth, reproduction, metabolism things have in common? So you might have your own questions, your own assumptions and your own way of doing this, but I encourage you to do it as well. Okay, so now let's get into more details, and here is our first slide. So 1.1 subtopic is talking about asking the question, what is living? So here on this slide I've placed a bunch of objects for you guys. Basically it's a mix of both living and non-living things, and I want you all to look at them closely and notice what is coming up for you in terms of criteria. Like when you look at these things and are already classifying them as living and non-living, what are you using as the main criteria? So when I think about living things, I think about things that are moving or breathing or can talk, or I know some living things that can fly and run really fast. So there are a lot of characteristics, right? Let's see if we can apply those as criteria of classification. So here I'm looking at an airplane and insects, and something that they have in common is flight. Both of them can fly, but that doesn't make an airplane a living object, right? Similarly, here there is a picture of a man laughing, and here is Amazon Alexa that also laughs sometimes and makes sounds basically. So what they have in common is ability to make sounds. But can I use that as a criteria to classify them as both living objects? Probably not. Similarly, you have a tree and cyanobacteria under the microscope, and what they do have in common is photosynthesis. So, can I use photosynthesis as a characteristic? They're both able to harness the sun's energy and make food. In this case, that's actually a good criteria to use. It's a metabolic process, and both of them are living organisms. So now we'll study this in a more organized way, and this is what our chapter is talking about. There are these characteristics which are divided into non-defining characteristics and defining characteristics. So under non-defining characteristics, we have growth and reproduction, and under defining characteristics, we have metabolism and consciousness. So let's back up a little bit and try to understand what this is exactly talking about. So non-defining characteristics means they have some exceptions. That means they are not always true. So there's a little bit of ambiguity around them. Whereas defining characteristics means there are no exceptions. So you can use these characteristics to classify something as living and non-living, and that criteria will always hold true. So there are no exceptions. We'll understand this better once we get deeper into each of these characteristics. Okay, let's get into our first topic, growth. So growth has these twin characteristics, which is increase in size and increase in number. This is something that you might be quizzed on. So increase in size is basically increase in mass from small to big. Similarly, increase in number means something has multiplied from one to few or from few to many. So that's something that is good to keep in mind. Now, growth occurs in both unicellular and multicellular organisms. When we think about unicellular organisms, for example, they could be microorganisms like amoeba, where growth happens through cell division. Similarly, in multicellular organisms, we have plants and animals both exhibiting growth, but it's a little different in these two organisms. In plants, growth happens throughout their lifespan. So starting from a seed to a sapling and a plant and to a tree, and again as it ages, growth continues. But this is not the case with animals, at least when we talk about physical characteristics and physical development of the body. Growth happens from childhood to adulthood. And after adulthood, all the developmental characteristics sort of stop at adulthood. However, in animals, growth does occur when repair is needed. So, for example, say you get hurt and there is a wound that needs to heal. So new skin needs to grow from underneath, and new epithelial cells need to be formed. So that's when growth occurs, and so growth occurs when repair is needed. So we'll move on to answering this important question that comes up after this, which is, why is growth not a defining characteristic? So if you go back to our mind map from this slide, we have put growth under the non-defining characteristic. And now the question is, okay, why is it so? So basically there are some exceptions to the rule. Remember, that's what I told about non-defining characteristics. They are not true all the time. So this is because, number one, some non-living things also grow. So there are a lot of things that exhibit this increase in number and increase in size. For example, mountains continue to grow as a result of shifts in tectonic plates. So this means that growth has occurred, but it doesn't mean that a mountain is a living thing. So because this exception is present, we cannot use growth as a defining characteristic. So another reason growth is not a defining characteristic is in unicellular organisms, the concept of growth and reproduction kind of mean the same thing. So there's not a lot of clarity around what is growth and what is reproduction. In other words, in animals, growth and reproduction are mutually exclusive events. They're separate processes that occur. And this is not the case when it comes to unicellular organisms. And so this is the other reason why growth is not a defining characteristic. I hope that was clear. So now we'll move on to the next process, which is reproduction. This also comes under a non-defining characteristic, and we will see why. So reproduction again happens in both unicellular and multicellular organisms. In unicellular organisms, like we just talked about, it happens through cell division. At least in the amoeba, you have the parent cell dividing into the two daughter cells, and this is called binary fission. And when it comes to multicellular organisms, we have two kinds of reproduction, which is sexual reproduction that is exhibited by plants and animals, and you have asexual reproduction, and some examples are fungi reproducing through spore formation, yeast generating buds, this process called budding, and planaria reproducing through regeneration. You don't have to remember all this right now, but just these examples are just to help you understand that asexual reproduction does exist in multicellular organisms. So now we'll move on to a similar question that we asked when we were studying growth, which is, why is reproduction not a defining characteristic? So one thing that makes answering this easy is we've already studied point number one, which is in unicellular organisms, growth and reproduction mean the same thing. So because there is this confusion, this overlapping of process, we are not able to have a defined way of classifying living and non-living things by using reproduction as a criteria. So we rule out this as a defining characteristic. And the other reason is there is the exception of some organisms that do not reproduce at all, but that does not mean that they are not living organisms. So for example, honeybees and class of honeybees called the worker bees are sterile, and hence they don't reproduce, but this does not mean that they are not living. So yeah, this is the other reason why we don't consider reproduction as a defining characteristic. So just to get an overview, we have finished learning about growth and reproduction under non-defining characteristics, and now we'll move on to the defining characteristic, that is metabolism and consciousness. Okay, so what do you think of when you hear the word metabolism? Basically, it is something to do with breaking down of things and building of things. Breaking down of compounds, the scientific term is catabolism, and building of compounds, the scientific term is anabolism. So basically, metabolism is all the anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions put together. So sum of all chemical reactions happening in a living organism is metabolism. And this is something that is always occurring in all living organisms, and there are no exceptions. Remember, we studied about photosynthesis in our previous slides. So that's a metabolic reaction, and that is something that is clearly used as a defining characteristic. And so cellular organization that is required for metabolism. What is cellular organization? Basically, cells being organized into tissues, tissues being organized into organs, and so on. This organization is required for metabolic process to occur, and hence metabolism and cellular organization go kind of hand in hand, and they're both required for life. And there's something that this chapter adds as a clarification, which is lab reactions. Basically, everything that we perform in the lab, a biochemical reaction that is happening in a living organism, can be simulated in a lab setting, and this is called as an in vitro process. So you can say, okay, if this reaction is happening, can we call this reaction itself as a living organism? And the textbook clarifies, saying that this is not the case. It can be called as a living reaction, but not as a living organism. So this is just a clarification, something that might be framed into a question possibly. Okay, I hope you guys are all clear about metabolism. Now we'll move on to the last characteristic, the last defining characteristic, which is consciousness. Okay, so what exactly is consciousness? There are many ways to define it, but for the purpose of our current learning, what it is basically response to a stimulus. And this stimulus can be in the form of anything, can be in the form of light, or a chemical, or sound. So there are many kinds of stimuli, and if an organism is able to respond to it through its sensory mechanisms, which could be our sense organs like eyes, our tongue and nose, and our touch, and our ability to hear, so it could be anything, and if we're able to respond to an outside stimulus, then we consider this organism as a living organism. And something to note here is it's only human beings that are capable of self-consciousness or self-awareness. That is, we are able to have a perception of our own existence. That makes sense. So here is another clarification, that the textbook adds, where it just wants to rule out any ambiguity. You might ask, patients in coma who are unfortunately brain dead are not conscious, like in the way we understand consciousness, but are they living? So the textbook clarifies saying yes, they are considered living organisms because they're still able to respond to stimuli. They're responding to medical treatment, they're responding to medication and other kinds of medical interventions, and hence we do consider them as conscious. Okay, so I hope that was clear, and I just wanted to wrap up this section, that is section 1.1, by talking about this last paragraph, which is basically saying all of us are interconnected through genetic processes, through evolutionary mechanisms, and all of this is possible because of our cellular organization and because of our metabolic processes. So just to review, we have cells being organized into tissues, tissues being organized into an organ, organs forming organ systems, and organ systems making organisms. So this classification kind of enables us to stay interconnected and be interdependent in this universe. So I hope that was clear, guys. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll get to them as soon as I can. And yeah, happy studying.